Hello and welcome to the LendAPI, a partner podcast. Today, my guest is Kurt Weiss. He is the VP of Products at Mastercard Identity. Welcome to the podcast, Kurt.
Great to be here, Rutger. Thanks.
Now, let's start off with how your part of the business got started.
Yeah, it's a great story. I've been with Mastercard now for about 4 years, but came on board through an acquisition. So initially I was hired into a company called whitepages.com, not the phone book, but was an attempt very successfully by our founder to effectively digitize the phone book. And that began the process of building up over 20 plus years a trove of public records, and that we started engineering into a really sophisticated graph database to allow for more and more repositories to come in. There's a lot of traffic that we were seeing coming to that website from businesses, as well as a lot of inbound asks for like, hey, can we get this via an API? We're doing a lot of searches on this with our agents. Could you deliver this some other way? So we spun up a business unit called White Pages Pro, which a lot of folks may be familiar with, that was focused on serving businesses and really honed in on the use case of identity risk and identity verification as what our core would be. As we solidified that, we spun out of White Pages and established ourselves as Ekata. And that business would later go on to be acquired by Mastercard and become the foundation of Mastercard Identity.
That is a very interesting origin story. Now, what is the number one use case currently that you solve for?
One of the biggest things that we're working with our customers on today is around the onboarding process, where so much of the legacy onboarding, especially if you're talking to older banks, is built around KYC, credit, and legacy things like the Patriot Act, which came about before the iPhone was here. So when you have this push to digital, a lot of what we see is that infrastructure has moved along slowly. That concept of identity has been slow to advance from know your customer, which doesn't even contemplate an email or an IP, which when you're dealing with a digital identity and a digital transaction, a lot more relevant than a physical address. And so I think a lot of folks have begun that switch. Obviously, we've got digital banks, neobanks coming up that are digital native first. And so we're seeing a lot better infrastructure there. But I still think the identity piece and how to resolve these identities is a challenge the banks are working with. And part of that is, number one, the difficulty of positively verifying a digital identity, especially amidst a fraud landscape that has boomed alongside this digital democratization of compute power and scale, but also because we're still tied down by this legacy concept of KYC and the compliance inherent there. And so where we are really coming in, especially around, underbanked populations, where I always see this as this double-edged sword. These are folks who the partners you're working with on your KYC data probably don't have these folks because they haven't been part of the financial system that we've created, digital or not. And so you end up having to challenge those folks and say, you got to prove to me who you are. And we end up treating them like fraudsters, using those mitigation steps that you would put if you saw a fraudulent identity come through. Now, the flip side of this is that these synthetic identities and other fraud schemes have tremendously easy access to the data required to pass KYC. So you have this step that we all have to perform that is almost designed to provide a red carpet for fraudsters while impacting this target customer that is key to every single bank out there. It doesn't matter if you're a legacy bank that didn't come out with a college credit card as your first piece. it's very clear we're aging out some of these populations that have bank accounts and have cards and have this today. And this new population is what is going to be sought after in order to provide the next cohort of customers for these banks. So that's the piece where we really play, is providing intelligence around the identity so that if you get a challenge at KYC, we can tell banks, hey, that actually is a real identity. We believe that the person leveraging it in this transaction is the owner of the identity acting in good faith. What can you do? And we're not the compliance experts, but I always give the example, because there are banks that still do this, sending someone to a retail branch or sending someone to talk to an agent on a call versus, can you offer a one-time passcode? Can you do some form of OCR, document verification? There's anything that you can do from a customer journey perspective in KYC to improve conversion. What we want to do is serve up the populations that you should be identifying for that. And we're doing that. And why we can get so sophisticated on how well we identify the good customer is because of our ability to identify that fraud and bring that out of the folks passing KYC and trying to move through your systems.
Yeah.
I think what I really like to see as well, all of that is still confined to this onboarding compliance space. But there are a lot of companies that we're seeing that are really going into the productization and starting to think about, okay, again, it's that customer experience. I might not have been able to complete KYC with this individual, but they are my customer. Maybe I don't want to challenge them right now. What can I do to advance them? Bring them closer to the product, closer into my ecosystem to secure that conversion, and now kind of bring up this next step. I need to complete KYC before the card is mailed, before it's issued, before they have access to loan, whatever it may be. But again, that conversion story is really what we want our customers to focus on and where we see the value of our data.
That is very interesting, that we've gone beyond know your customer, but really say, hey, who's the identity and what's the completeness of that identity.
The challenge is we really don't know your customer. And I mean, ideally, we know that they're not on the OFAC list and these other things, right? This is really important.
Yep.
But there's a lot more to know about your customer in a digital transaction. And it's important that you try to take in all facets of that. And that's what we're aiming to do at Mastercard.
No, that makes total sense. Now, tell me one of your favorite customer stories.
Obviously, my favorite ones are where we're most successful. And I think the customers that really delight me are the ones that are focused on this conversion. A lot of times, that's going to fall in the fintech space where we're looking at these customers focused on high growth, et cetera. I see a lot of different titles these days. And I'm often explaining internally to our marketing team, we talk about personas and the like. We may be targeting a fraud team, but you have to understand these fraud teams are often misnamed right now, right? Because they really do manage digital identity. They're the only ones that have access to the information about the email, the device, the behavior, because that's not part of the compliance scope. But we are seeing things like head of onboarding, head of digital identity, that I think are really trying to merge these two. And the success stories that I like are the ones that really consider these not just parallel, but complementary processes. And we had a customer one time that effectively was able to work with their lawyers and their compliance team to create, what I had been referring to as TSA pre-check, right? How do you create this experience for customers that pose no fraud risk to you? Now, if they also pass KYC with flying colors, that's great. We're off to the races. Do you have that experience today, though? And they got really excited to build that. But the flip side of it was they had these core customers very likely in this unbanked range where they had to take different action on KYC, and they figured out a way to get down to some very simple friction steps that weren't brought in as a challenge to the customer, as a stop, but actually said, kind of like, hey, one more thing we need to do before we bring you in, right? Communicating and really creating a story for the customer. That to me is kind of the most exciting. I talk a lot at conferences about, curious, how many of you actually talk to your marketing departments about when a new promo is going out? And that communication is often so fragmented. But I think to be successful, to separate yourselves from your competitors, you have to bring that concept of the customer journey into things, even if it is compliance. And you're saying, well, we just have to do this. This is a process they have to go through. You still have the ability to create a welcoming environment and a story that is communicating to the customer that you're moving through or bringing you to this product you're seeking. And that's so important today when we talk about conversion.
That is a very interesting example where people actually come together and say, yes, obviously we want to prevent fraud, but we still want to make sure that it is a good experience, right? And saying that, hey, we have to do this is not an excuse for saying, hey, this has to be a bad experience because we just have to check this box. You can potentially do it in a much more customer-friendly way.
And I think the interesting thing, it's not just us, right? This isn't a very novel idea that Mastercard Identity has come up with. I think we execute on it very well. But, what I'm always curious about when I get a chance to talk with our customers, I really see that the infrastructure, the tools that people have to approach this, right? There's so many more tools from a KYC perspective to help you complete it in higher converting, more automating ways. There's more identity information, behavior, device. We're fortunate to be able to bring all those together at Mastercard Identity. But while that seems to be changing, and you get this message from the vendors and from the tools that, hey, think of this holistically, think of what you can do here. It's still unclear to me how the banks using these tools have actually crossed that gap and how many of them actually purchase these and use them towards conversion or stick with well, we're still solving the fraud. That's our focus.
Right. Yeah.
And I always tell people, however big your fraud problem is, it's that big and you can cut costs by removing some of it. But when you look at conversion, right, the sky is kind of the limit in terms of the revenue you can generate, the long-term lifetime customer value you can bring. I really want to continue to see and hear from our customers that, again, they're leveraging what we're able to bring to the market to really flip that story for the customers.
Now, that is probably a good point to wrap it up on. Thank you so much, Kurt, for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. It was an absolute pleasure. Look forward to speaking more.
Perfect. And this was another episode of the LendAPI Partner Podcast. We'll see you on another episode.